You can only become an authentic person when you are able to say, I will die. You can say they will die. You can even say my loved ones will die. But you can only be totally mature or reach authenticity when you're able to say, I will die.
Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio.
We are often in danger of glib talk about death. It's easy, again, to speak about it in a trivial kind of way. I believe we really have to beware of that.
Joining Father Bacik in today's reflections are Father Richard Feigenbaum, college counselor and advisor at St. Francis de Sales High School in Toledo, Ohio, and program director Mark Ferguson.
What death does is set up that kind of final limit. You know, it is the end of life as we know it for ourselves. It seems as though, to the degree that I can accept that and see that there is a limit to my life, I am then in a better position to deal with the present moment.
Today's Reflections focuses on the topic of dealing with death. Here's Father Bacik.
No, as we're talking about this whole topic of death, I'm reminded of Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, a story she tells when she first began her studies about death. You know who that is, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, a Swiss psychiatrist.
Of death and dying.
Right, has written the book Death and Dying, and is well known for that, and lately has been well known for other things. But today we'll try to concentrate on the death business. And well, a group of theology students, as I recall the story, in Chicago came to her and said, well, we want some help on studying death. And they came to her because she was a doctor. And she said, well, really, I don't know a whole lot about that myself, but what we ought to do is go talk to some dying patients. So they went to a hospital and said, well, we want to talk to some of the dying patients. And they said, well, we don't have any here. We don't have any dying patients. And that's when Elizabeth Ross began to see that we had a problem. And in some ways that epitomizes, I suppose, the problem of death as I see it in our culture, and that is its fundamental denial. And you see that happening in many ways. I suppose we see it in the fact that we take the old people and put them off someplace, and just thinking personally how hard it is to deal with the aging process. One could think of the aging process of one's parents or one's close relatives, and to think of what our emotional reaction is to that. Or going to visit people in the hospital who are very seriously ill. The other great way we see that, I suppose, is in the funeral practices that we find in our country. That so much of it is designed to shield us from the fact of death. Now, my father has died in the recent past, and so I have been through this, and you almost have to struggle to stay in touch with death as it's going along. So you have things like the mortician taking over after the death occurs, and you're sort of just put to the side. You're not part of the process anymore. It even happens before that, so that some people want to keep you out of the room when they're dying, for example. Although I must say we've ran into some wonderful nurses that way ourselves that were very open to this dying process. But so then there's the business of closing the casket in the funeral home, as though it needs to be closed when you're not looking, as though that somehow is going to shield you from this. Or you take the body out to the cemetery, and it's put there above the ground, and it's not lowered while you're there, thinking that that is too much grief involved. So you can see so much of the practice that surrounds funerals and the dying process shields us from the reality. And it seems as though even the religious side of it does this. In the Catholic Church, which I'm, of course, very familiar with that tradition, there is a movement to have the Mass of the Resurrection when people die. And very often that Mass takes on a more joyful character. And some people have used that really as a shield from looking at this problem of death. I remember one sister who wanted me to have the funeral of her father. This was in New York a number of years ago, and her one statement to me was, "I don't want anything of grief or sorrow or sadness said at the Mass. I want it to be all upbeat, all positive, all joy, all resurrection." And this another vignette comes to my mind as I'm talking about this, and that is a woman came to me very distraught and upset about her own life, and was extremely depressed about it. And as we're going on, she's talking about the death of her husband and the funeral, and she made a telling statement. She said, "During that whole process, they never let me grieve. They didn't let me grieve, even at the funeral Mass. There was all of this joy and resurrection business." So while I believe in Catholic liturgy, we've made a lot of advances on at the funeral Masses, and it is done much better than it was in the past, still we are in danger of playing into the hands of the cultural problem, which is death denial. Most of the people I've dealt with in these situations do have as their first tendency not to face it, to look away from it. And what I have found myself doing is encouraging people to do that. I know I dealt with a young man recently who was such an inspiration to me, and we were talking about a death of one of his loved ones, and he had the unpleasant task of calling his father about this. And he at first didn't want to do that. He wanted somebody else to do it for him. Which seemed like a very natural reaction. In fact, I think he was being very altruistic because he thought someone who was there near his father could comfort his father in that situation. Mm-hmm. But in talking to the young man about it, I encouraged him, or at least raised the question with him, wouldn't it be better if you called him yourself? Don't you think that you ought to face up to this responsibility, meet it yourself, and inform your father of this tragic death of his daughter? And as a matter of fact, the young man did choose to do that, and I believe in doing so did it magnificently and really came through in the crisis, and was extremely helpful to his father in this situation, and I think in the long run will feel better about it himself.
I can think of a situation where my aunt back in New York was dying of cancer a number of years ago, and her daughter dropped out of college, came home, and attended to her for about the last month. She had to be hospitalized. The daughter handled the situation beautifully. She was a sophomore in college. The people who couldn't comprehend the situation were the what we would consider the adults in the family.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, my own mother, who was my mother's sister, could not understand why the daughter could be so comfortable with that reality.
Mm-hmm.
I know she hasn't studied Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's book
mm-hmm.
to any great extent, and yet she seemed to come by that naturally. What
mm-hmm.
quality is that where somebody can be comfortable with the dying process?
Well, I would think that it is dependent upon one's maturity level in a way, and it's dependent upon one's faith. I believe that if we have a faith context within which to place death, we're going to be able to face it more directly. It has always seemed true to me that if we think of death as the end, if we think of life as we know it as self-contained, that it is going to be harder to look at death, especially tragic death, death of young people, death of talented people, death of people who we feel have something to contribute, or who we are in love with, or who love us in return. That has seemed to me to really make it more difficult to do if you think it's the end. Now, if we have this a more positive faith, as we find, for example, in the Christian tradition, that death is a passageway into another life, that it is a movement into a glorified existence where there are no more tears, and where we are in the hands of God, where we inhabit the heavenly Jerusalem. With that kind of imagery and that kind of sense, it appears as though it is more possible to face death. I mean, I've been very inspired by listening to people speak about death in that faith context. I think of a psychologist I know who I respect greatly, and I happened to be with him as his daughter, the young daughter, was dying of leukemia. And this man said to his daughter at some point, now when you see Jesus, you say a prayer to Jesus for us. It was in a very simple way of saying it. This man is a very sophisticated man and a man of faith, and in being able to say that, it was a projection of his own inner faith, which I felt allowed him to speak that open way, in that open fashion, to his daughter, and to do a better job of accepting it. So I'm going to have to answer your question, I think, in terms of that faith, having a perspective within which we can look at death. Although I must say here that I also know people who don't have that faith, who have faced death heroically. So, I don't want to make too much of that and say it's impossible for somebody else. It just strikes me as being facilitated, enabled by this faith. And I think the other phrase I suggested was maturity. That is, the integration of one's personality, where we have gathered ourselves enough, are at ease with negative things in life, are able to face our own fears, our own grief, and that seems to allow that to happen. Elizabeth Ross talks about some woman who was a cleaning woman in the hospital, and this woman would go in and would have a profound effect on dying patients. And she did it because she had suffered greatly in her own life and had come to terms with death of her loved ones, and then therefore was at ease in talking in a simple way with these dying people. So I don't think in any way it's a function of education or any other factors, but it is dependent on faith and personal maturity or integration.
You made a comment about the sense of loss seems to be heightened when a young person or a talented person dies. And I can't help but thinking of an experience I had a couple of years ago working in a parish in the Detroit area, where in a 1-month period, 3 young people in the parish, ages 19 through 22, died what we would consider to be, tragic or useless death. I was at a complete loss by the time the 3rd funeral was in the planning stages for what to prepare for a homily. One of the most interesting things being that it was the same congregation, and basically we had already visited the notion of hope in an afterlife, the fact that we should be joyful at the moment of resurrection. And I remember going to the funeral home probably being more in need of advice than being able to give it as a priest, and talking to the father of the young man who had been senselessly killed in an accident. And he likened his situation to the Lord walking through a garden and choosing at will what things were to be picked and what weren't to be picked. And at sometimes the flower or the fruit to be picked would be the one that was at its peak. And he likened that to his own son, who he felt was at his peak in terms of talents, vitality. I thought it was a rather beautiful way of coping with a sense of loss with a young person or a talented person.
Just my comment on what you were saying, Rich, about I think that, at a loss at what to say in a situation. I believe there is a proper sense of that we are often in danger of glib talk about death. That it's easy, again, to speak about it in a trivial kind of way. I believe we really have to beware of that. People who are suffering through the death of a loved one or in the dying process themselves understand the gravity of it. And in talking about it, we really should be careful of that, not to speak glibly. The other thing I believe is that we, people who hold a particular religious faith, Christianity for example, need very often to hear the fundamental points repeated. We need that story told again, precisely because it fades from us. We lose it. We lose focus. We lose touch with it. The primary message of hope that Christianity gives us. It seems as though the story needs to be told over and over again. And the other thing that struck me as you were talking, I heard a priest preach at a particularly tragic funeral not all that long ago, in which he enunciated for the people the spirit of protest. I have never done that myself, but it has intrigued me since, and I'm really not sure exactly what to make of it. But he was pointing out how many people there were saying, "Why? God, how could you allow that to happen?" It's almost like Job speaking to God, and Job saying, "Weigh my cause in the balance here. No, I don't deserve this punishment. I've been leading a good life. I want a fair hearing." It was almost that sense. And I believe that some of the people there who were grieving terribly did find some help in the fact that the man who preached at the service enunciated the protest they felt in their heart. God, why should this happen? It shouldn't have happened. You took a young man, a father of a family. That shouldn't have really happened. So maybe that is something else that can be thought about as we try to articulate the feelings that are going on at that time. There appears to be a certain protest that maybe is part of the whole process. I guess Elizabeth Ross, we keep returning to her because she really has done an awful lot in revolutionizing our understanding of death, the dying process. She's at least focused it for the popular mind. Many people study her books and so on. And she points out to us, doesn't she, about these stages that people go through in the dying process themselves. There is a rebellion and an anger and a bargaining that people go through that eventually leads to some sort of peaceful acceptance of this fact. Well, the same token, people in the grieving process go through stages as well. And maybe when they're feeling rebellious and protesting, that needs to get enunciated as well and articulated. It's back to the same kind of thing, Mark, that I was trying to say earlier on, that the negative emotions that we have do need to be faced. They need to be named in some way, and that brings them out into the open, gives them an objectivity, and allows us to deal with them better.
What do you say to a dying person, a loved one, who suddenly finds out that he or she is dying? Suddenly you're confronted with his or her denial. I don't want to die, I'm too young to die, or else I have too much to accomplish yet before I go. You were saying before, Father Bacik, that we should approach it maturely and put the person at ease and so on, but I offhand don't really find that approach very helpful. At least to me, I wouldn't know what a mature approach would be, because I think, reflecting culture as I often do, I would say, well, that's really too bad. Let me deal with something else that I can deal with right away. How do we cope with friends, with relatives who go through this process? What do we say?
I think that we probably end up doing what we can in the situation, so that if somebody is capable of dealing with this fact, we encourage them to do so. So that if they are able to allow the dying person to talk and could listen to them verbalize their protest or their anger, their bargaining, their peacefulness, then I would encourage that. I'd tell them that, well, when you go in to see your mother now who's dying, you don't have to say a lot, but if she wants to talk about what she's going through, let her talk. And don't feel like you have to give her some simple answer to it. And don't just tell her everything's all right, but try to absorb what she's trying to tell you. Allow her to speak to that. Other people I talk to say, well, I could never do that. I'm just not ready for that. And I would encourage them to be present. Go there. Be in the room. Try to be as realistic as you can be. If it's just a matter, if you can't say anything, just hold your mother's hand. Just be present, just sit in the room for a while. Try to manage, in other words, what you can. If somebody was really having a lot of anxiety about that, maybe I would encourage them just to visit briefly and to say something encouraging to their parents. So I believe it's dependent upon our capabilities at any point. Although I must say, in my own dealing with people, I find that people very often respond with greater vigor and maturity than one might originally think. People will say, for example, I couldn't possibly manage that. But you might say, well, why don't you go and give it a try? and at least spend some time with the dying person, then they very often find out that they find a hidden strength. A surprising power comes forward. It's one of my reasons for believing in the workings of the Spirit in our world, because of this surprising energy that often flows in us. And people often say at the end of experiences like that, I don't know how I really did that. I can't imagine how I accomplished that.
Jim, I think one of the biggest problems that I have experienced in either myself coping with death or in helping other people to cope with death is the fact that in our society, if we can't get something in one way, we can either get it in another way or we can get something to substitute for it. And when death occurs, loss occurs.
Right.
And there's absolutely no way to substitute for that loss.
Right. That is the finality of it. As you express it, I think that's what I felt so strongly in my own father's death, the finality of it. That my own mind in troubled situations always goes to alternatives. My mind just almost immediately jumps to, well, what can we do about it? And what's the alternative? And how could we straighten this out? And in that case, you're just finally up against a total limit. And there isn't anything you can do about it. And that fact seems to grind on you or hit you or come at you with full force. It does set up a very positive notion of death that we're trying to get across, and so that it doesn't appear to be morbid. Let me try to say it this way, that what death does is set up that kind of final limit. It is the end of life as we know it for ourselves. And it seems as though, to the degree that I can accept that and see that there is a limit to my life, I am then in a better position to deal with the present moment. It gives a greater significance to it. I mean, you can see it very concretely if you think that you're going to only see your mother, this is the last time you're going to see her, for example, she's going to die after you talk to her, then you're going to mine the riches of that moment. You're going to try to make the most out of it. You're going to be very kind. You're going to talk seriously. You're going to have a warm farewell, and so on. And it seems like the notion that death sets a limit has that therapeutic effect on us. That is, it tells us that the present moment is all we have, in a way, that that's where the action is, so that we would seize it. The great philosopher Martin Heidegger has said that you can only become an authentic person when you are able to say, I will die. You can say they will die. You can even say my loved ones will die. But you can only be totally mature or reach authenticity when you're able to say, I will die, because that sets a limit to one's life. And in looking at it in the terms of that limit, you say, I must seize all of the chances that I have along the way. Now, sometimes that seems like a hard notion to get across. I put it negatively. Another philosopher has said that if life went on, as it does now indefinitely for us, it just went on with all of its joys and sorrows, good and bad, that would indeed be hell. It would be hell because what we really want would never happen. That is a final fulfillment for all of our hopes. We would never achieve the total integration that we want. We would never experience the amount of and quality of love that we want. We would never know as much as we want because we can never do it in this life. So that it's only death that is a potential passageway to a total fulfillment, that which Christian people call heaven. So you're back again, you see, in some sort of a faith perspective that says that death is a passageway into this other life.
It sounds like you're suggesting that people are sometimes hard on themselves in the sense that they don't provide themselves a view of life and a view of the future because they don't expose themselves to it.
Right.
Through contact with church.
Religious tradition.
Faith.
Yes. Right. I mean, when you at the time of death is when the great value of being rooted in a religious tradition seems to come out. And again, I don't want it to sound as though other people who don't have that don't deal with death well, because I know they often do. I've seen it. But at the time of death, you experience again the power of a religious tradition to help you. I often think that what happened, the whole funeral mass, for example, in the Catholic tradition, the prayers that we have in the Christian tradition, the Judeo tradition, is an attempt to ward off chaos. It keeps us rooted somehow. It keeps us from coming undone. It allows us to see again where we fit and how we are placed in a larger context. And I think the ritual that we go through in the religious traditions at that time really helps us. It sets up a grieving time. It gives us a final meaning to life. It tells us in imaginative ways that the dead person is in the hands of God, that they've moved to a better life. See, all of that, it seems to me, really enables us to face death. Mark, you brought up right at the very beginning about, this idea it seems natural to escape from death and natural not to face it. And I believe that is really true. But what we see in this sort of philosophical and theological perspective that I've tried to provide here, that there is a real positive value in facing it. When we're able to face it, personally, we're able to be of greater help to our loved ones when they're going through it. We also, when we're able to see death in a positive way as the end of our life, and therefore putting emphasis on what we do now, that would enhance life. It would help us to seize the moments that are given to us. And I believe this theological or faith perspective can really help us to deal with it. That's one of the great values of the Judeo-Christian tradition as we know it. It provides a context of meaning for that. And as we look at our Christian tradition, we say, well, Jesus Christ has been raised to life, that he's the firstborn of those who are to be saved, that the real conclusion of it all comes for us when we join the Lord in heaven. And that really is a positive viewpoint, I think, and really would help all of us to deal better and more constructively with this phenomenon of death.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion were Father Richard Feigenbaum, college counselor and advisor at St. Francis de Sales High School in Toledo, and program director Mark Ferguson. The topic of this discussion was dealing with death. If you have any comments about today's program or any ideas for topics you'd like to hear discussed, please write to Reflections in care of WLQR, Toledo, Ohio, 43623. Produced in the studios of WLQR, Reflections is directed by Mark Ferguson. Executive producer is Mary Beth Kirchner. Reflections is brought to you by the Genesis Radio Network in cooperation with the Diocese of Toledo.